Good afternoon, everybody. We're so happy that you joined us today. We'll just wait a few minutes while everyone joins the webinar. And please do let us know in the chat box where you're logging in from. We always find that interesting. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to EAPO's webinar on sexual violence among older adults, practical approaches for trauma-informed responses. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. All of the attendees during today's webinar will be muted. We encourage you to engage through the chat box today. And as always, we provide a recording of our webinars, and you will be able to find that on our website. Also, we're happy to have ASL interpreters here today, and you will see their name and their image will be available throughout the whole webinar. And now if you need to adjust the size of the interpreter, first you can pin or spotlight them so their image is large throughout the whole webinar. And if you need to make the video bigger or vice versa, the slideshow smaller, you can drag the lines between the video and the slide deck to make it bigger or smaller. And of course, this guest speaker today will be visible during the whole presentation. And we encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box and just reserve the chat box for comments and any technical issues you may have during the webinar. And of course, at the end of the webinar, we encourage you to fill out our evaluation. We're always looking for new topics, feedback on the content that we've provided. So please it will only take about a minute to do. So please, I encourage you to fill out the evaluation. EAPO endeavors to honor the land and its treaties by strengthening our relationship and responsibilities to them. We live and work on Métis, Anishinaabeg, Ojibwe, and Cree territories. The presence of settlers is not neutral. It has had and continues to have devastating impacts on many aspects of life for Indigenous peoples. Many of our practices, including the way we care for our elders, the way we educate, and our methods of creating community came to these lands through the ongoing process of colonialism. We now hold a new understanding in our interactions and engagements with this land and its people. There is important work being done by many nations and allies to ensure the continued thriving of communities and knowledge systems. Those of us who are settlers need to recognize that the knowledge and the way of doing things may not be the priority as we work towards a safe Ontario for all seniors. Thank you. So the presentation flow today, we're going to look at increasing your awareness of the unique needs of older adults who have been victims of historical sexual assaults. Also on building your knowledge around really practical approaches in responding and intervening and supporting older victims of sexual violence through a trauma-informed lens. We do always hold a high priority on the question and answer period of the session. And of course, we will be sharing some of our own resources that we've developed over the years. So a little bit about us, who we are and what we do. We are a small nonprofit agency, and we're generously funded by the Ministry of Senior and Accessibility. And I think everyone here can agree with our mission is that simply we envision an Ontario where all seniors are free from abuse. And I strongly believe that we all play a role in this. So I'm so thrilled to have our guest speaker today, Lynn Cohen. I initially met Lynn. She's very ingrained in Durham region, and I met her at the Durham Elder Abuse Network meetings. Lynn is a registered social worker through the College of Social Workers and Social Service Workers. She's worked in the field of violence against women for nearly 40 years. And she's been a tireless advocate for women who have experienced sexual violence or different forms of abuse. For the past 18 years, Lynn has worked at the Durham Rape Crisis Center as a counselor and the public educator, and believes strongly in the importance of creating awareness, providing education around this issue. Lynn works extremely close with other agencies in Durham region. As I said, she sits on the Durham Elder Abuse Network, the Women's Committee of Durham Region, Sex Workers Support Circle, and the Human Trafficking Coalition. She also does outreach at the Durham Region Intimate Violent Empowerment Network and John Howard Society. In her work, Lynn has identified that the community of older adults is often missed when we're examining this issue. And she truly believes that having more conversations around sexual violence is so important. And she's absolutely committed to creating these spaces. So I couldn't be more thrilled with our speaker today. So without further ado, I welcome Lynn to our webinar. Thank you so much, Lynn.
Thank you so very much, Laura. And before I begin with talking about anything, the very first thing that I want to do is to thank Laura so very much for inviting me to be a part of this webinar. One of the best ways that we can reach out to different communities is by engaging with those different communities. And that very much includes, so for example, if we're wanting to reach out to the community of older adults, what better place to get information and to learn and to understand the needs of that community without consulting with and partnering with and collaborating with agencies that are already doing that work with older adults. So I thank you so much, Laura, for this opportunity that you've given to me and allowing me to come in and do this webinar today. I'm very excited as well. I want to just start, I think, by just saying a little bit about how I came to be a public educator. Before I talk a little bit about the Durham Rape Crisis Center and who we are and what we do, I want to share a little bit about myself with all of you who are out there today in this webinar. I'm a counselor by trade. I was not trained to be a public educator. I took my program some close to 40 years ago as a social worker, and that was the work that I wanted to be able to do. Over the years, I discovered that it was really important to me to be able to share knowledge and share information and create awareness around this unbelievably important issue that to some extent we as a society don't really talk enough about. And so being a public educator sort of came to me almost by accident when different opportunities presented themselves to talk about this work and to talk about how we serve the clients that we work with and how we work with them and what's important. So I kind of became a public educator by accident out of my desire to share information and to create spaces where we can also create that awareness around this issue. So that's just a little bit about me as a public educator. I am predominantly, primarily a counselor. The largest part of my role at the center is as a counselor. But when opportunities present themselves like this to partner up and to collaborate and share information, we jump on those opportunities. So the Durham Rape Crisis Center, a little bit like EAPO, is very small. We're a very small staff. We only have 8 employees. We've been around roughly since about the mid-70s. It's actually a great little story that I love to share with people. In the early 70s, a group of women came together and they pooled their baby bonus checks because they recognized that there was a need for specialized sexual violence services here in Durham region. At that particular time, there was no domestic violence sexual assault care center at the hospital. That hadn't been created yet. And there were no specialized services. And this group of women saw a need. They pooled their money together and they started the 24-hour crisis and support line. And then they applied for core funding. And in 1979, we started to receive core funding from our primary funder, which is the Ministry of the Attorney General. We call them MAG. MAG, of course, is the one that supports all the programs and services that we have to offer at the center. And there's a variety of different services. Of course, we have counseling. We have both individual counseling and we have a variety of different groups that we also offer to clients that use our services. I do just want to share that up until a few years ago, we had the, I almost want to say the luxury of being able to do long-term open-ended work in this area because we recognize that the impact of sexual violence or trauma on victims was so far-reaching and so long-lasting and had been a part of their lives potentially for such a period of time that we knew that we needed to do the more long-term counseling. Unfortunately, a few years ago, as our waiting list grew and grew and grew and grew, and folks were sitting on our wait list for upwards of a year to a year and a half, our funder essentially came in and said, You can't continue to do this. You can't call yourselves a crisis center and then not be able to meet the needs of people who are in fact in crisis, and then put them on a wait list for a year or more. So although it was a real struggle for us, we sort of reevaluated our counseling program. And now we're only able to offer up to a maximum of 16 individual sessions. And that can be spread out over a longer period of time. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that we meet with somebody every week for 16 weeks. It can be spread out. And our work has become much more what I would call sort of much more solution, much more goal focused. And we really try to address the needs and the issues that our clients present while trying to keep it also very present focused, so that we can work on the things that are challenging for folks, or that are creating difficulties or concerns for folks in their lives. As I said, we have a number of different groups. We have meditation groups, yoga groups, trauma groups, drop-in groups, ongoing groups. We've tried very hard, especially in this last year, since the beginning of the pandemic, to try to create even more groups, to try to make our services even more accessible. We have continued to provide all of our services through the pandemic. We do everything virtually now, through Zoom, by phone. So it's really interesting because it's really shifted the dynamic and what counseling looks like when you're doing it virtually rather than in person. But the one good thing that it means is that it means that we are now in fact more accessible potentially to folks who might not necessarily have been able to access our services previously. We do a lot of public education. As I said, we do a number of different things. We take part in lots of different community education and awareness events. We create events of our own. We partner up with other organizations and agencies to do events. And again, these events are very much around education and awareness, and trying to increase people's knowledge and understanding around this issue. I do want to just mention, it's always important, I think, for me to say this, that you will notice that as I'm going through my presentation, although I do tend to use the word folks and women sometimes interchangeably, I do need to share that at the center, we are only able to provide services to women or to those who identify as women. This is the funding that all of the rape crisis centers across the province of Ontario receive. And we are limited to working with women identified folks only, except in some of the centers in the far north, where they might potentially be attached to a shelter or another agency, and they are able to provide services to men. But the majority of centers are not. So I just want to be clear about that when I'm talking, and I may use the term women, it's because that's who's coming into the center. That's who we serve. So that's a little bit about the Durham Rape Crisis Center. So our webinar today, talking about sexual trauma amongst older adults. Why is this important? Why do we need to be doing this? So at the Rape Crisis Center, we've been talking a lot in the last couple of years about other ways to increase our services, to potentially look for other funding to support other programs and services, like, for example, men. We understand that men also experience sexual trauma. In fact, one of the things that we know is that the majority of serial pedophiles or child molesters will more often than not target boys. So we know that boys and men are experiencing it as well. And it's important to acknowledge that. And when we go out into the community, which we used to do pre-COVID, one of the things, we often had men in the audience as well. And I think that that's really important, that we speak to men as well as to women, because they're the other half of what makes up our society and our communities. And as much as we need to educate women around certain things, around safety, around boundaries, we also need to be educating men around these issues as well. And I very much enjoy being able to go to spaces where men are also included. I should probably add at this time, I meant to say it before and I didn't, so I'll just say it now. Public education also looks very different, of course, as you can imagine. Everything is virtual. One of the things that I always really enjoyed, I myself am an older adult, and I often say that I do things very old school. And one of the things that I always enjoyed in doing public education was being able to go to different places and walk around, engage with the audience, gauge where the audience was at. Did they appear interested? Am I going in the right direction? I would, make eye contact with people. I would ask questions of individuals. I would ask folks to, raise their hands and answer a question. It's very different now, of course, because we can't do that. I don't mind admitting to all of you out there that it's a little bit disconcerting to not be able to see the audience and to see the level of interest that might be happening out there. The only face that I get to see right now is my own and the ASL interpreters. So at least I get to see them as well. But it does make things very different. So why is it important that we have these conversations? Why are these partnerships and these collaborations important? As Laura mentioned in her introduction, I'm now sitting on the Durham Elder Abuse Network. And one of the reasons that I wanted to sit on this network and to be a part of this important network is because these are the folks who are working directly with older adults. These are the folks that are going places where older adults might be residing, or older adults might be attending programs through their agencies or their organizations. And I think it's really, really important that when we're looking for expertise, who has better expertise than the older adults themselves in what's important for them and what they need, and the folks that are working with these older adults, because they're the ones that know, and they're the ones that have these already pre-existing relationships. I started to talk about this at the center probably a year and a half ago or so, pre-COVID. I started to question why we didn't have more older adults on the wait list, for example. We have programs that are specific for human trafficking, for sex workers, for youth. Why don't we have a program that is specific to older adults? And so why is this important? Why is it necessary to be having these conversations? It's because we know that many, many older adults and or seniors are in fact dealing with the impact of sexual violence or sexual trauma from a variety of different sources. So what I mean by that is they may have experienced their trauma at different points in their lives or under different circumstances. Laura, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Before I go into this, I want to ask a question. We were going to do a poll, but I'm just going to pose the question now. And I'm going to ask if folks are willing to just put something in the chat box, like yes or no. This is one of the questions that I ask when I've gone out previously, when I've had the opportunity to actually go to a place where there are older adults and seniors. And this is one of the questions that I like to ask to start to generate conversation. So the question that I would like to pose to everybody is there anybody out there in the webinar audience who is single, who is divorced, who is perhaps a widow or widower, Yes. Okay. I'm getting a bit of a mix, I'm noticing in the chat box, but certainly it looks like, and I know that, there's over 250 people today, and I don't necessarily expect everyone to respond. But it certainly looks like there are a number of single, divorced, widowed folks in the audience. So the next question that I'd like to ask is, for those of you that are, have any of you tried online dating? Nope, no interest. I like that one. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much for those of you that participated and contributed. Okay, great. We just heard from Giselle, who's happily married. Wonderful. It's always great to hear that. The reason I ask these questions is because dating today for older adults is vastly different than it was back in the day. And because I've now acknowledged to all of you that I am an older adult, I get to say back in the day. So back in the day, the way that we met people was much more fluid. We met them in school. They might have been in our class or in a different class. We might have met them through friends. They might have been an older or younger sibling of one of our friends. But the point is that once upon a time when, somebody just put in the chat, I miss those days. I think many of us do. It was very different back then because you really did have an opportunity to see somebody, to meet someone, to get to know someone over the course of a period of time. It's not like that anymore. And even pre-COVID, I mean, certainly now with the pandemic, it's even more so. But online dating has been a thing for a long, long time now. And, I think for folks to think that older adults aren't in the dating world, they're wrong. And I think the proof is out there just by virtue of the fact that there are actually specific sites that are geared towards older adults. I know there's one called ourtime.com. There's one that's +50, I think. And I'm sure that there's a whole bunch of others that I'm not aware of because I'm not doing online dating. So obviously older adults are in the dating world, and they are, in fact, in many situations using online dating. And so what that then brings up is, do we really know who we're meeting? And this is a concern for me with online dating across the board, whether we're talking to a group of younger women or whether we're talking to a group of older folks. The reality is that we don't always know who we're talking to online until perhaps we have a chance to maybe visually see them, visualize them, or perhaps have an opportunity to meet. And then when we meet, what happens? The reality is that online dating, although it can work for some, and I suppose it's a great tool to have out there for folks that maybe don't have other forums or avenues in which they can meet people. But the reality is that it can be very risky. And I have spoken to way too many women who have met someone online and jumped to the conclusion that that person is safe or healthy, and they turn out not to be. And folks have found themselves in potentially unhealthy or dangerous situations, and perhaps experiencing being sexually assaulted. So I think that's one way that we know that older adults might experience some form of sexual trauma or sexual violence or sexual assault. Can you go to the next slide, please, Laura? Thank you. So this is one of the other ways, and it may be a little bit bigger than the first one that I spoke to, but it's just a little bit different. We know that many older adults may have experienced some form of sexual abuse or sexual violence in their lives as a child. And one of the things that I'm seeing sort of a pattern in is that they keep this burden to themselves their whole lives. They don't talk about it. They don't disclose. And they didn't disclose perhaps when they were children, or maybe they did, and they didn't get a good response, or they weren't believed, or they were perhaps blamed for the abuse. But either way, they've carried this burden with them their entire lives. And it has impacted and affected every single aspect of their lives. What their teenage years were like, what their young adult years were like, what their older adult years were like, how it informed them in terms of relationships and intimacy. Did they get into potentially an abusive relationship and experience intimate partner violence? Do they have a sense of themselves? Do they have self-worth? Do they have self-value? And often for folks that are a little bit older, the question then becomes, why bother? What's the point of talking about this? How is it going to change things now? I've had this with me my whole life. Nothing is going to be different. And I don't believe that it's fair or appropriate that they should have to carry the weight of this burden with them their entire lives without being able to get some support around that. Because although it might not change their lives that they've lived, we know we can't go back in time and do things differently. But what we can shift or change is how we feel about things moving forward. And so if being able to get support around this, being believed that it happened, not being blamed for what happened, working through all that guilt and shame and self-blame, it can really make a difference for the rest of somebody's life. And it can change how they see themselves in the world, how they see the world at large, how they see relationships. It can change everything. And I think that they deserve that. The next slide, please, Laura. No, I've missed one. I'm sorry. I wanted to just, maybe it's the next one. Yes, that was the one I was looking for. Thank you very much, Laura. I should not only take a moment at this time to not only thank Laura for inviting me to participate in this, but for agreeing to be my tech person and doing the slideshow for me so that I don't have to think about that or worry about that. Thank you so much, Laura. So this is a tough one, right? I mean, it's all tough. Talking about sexual violence within the context of a dating relationship is tough. Talking about sexual trauma or abuse that might have happened to someone as a child is tough. And this one is really tough as well. Sexual abuse in care homes. And we know that this happens. I think for a very long time, we sort of did the proverbial put our heads in the sand. And maybe we weren't aware of what was going on. And maybe we were aware, but just didn't really want to talk about it because, quite frankly, it's horrific, it's horrible, and it's frightening to know that older folks, older adults, seniors may possibly be in settings like long-term care facilities, nursing homes, hospitals, and they are also being abused. in some way. We don't like to think as a society that the very place that should be taking care of our older adults are in fact sometimes the places where this perpetration is happening and this abuse is happening. And we don't like talking about it. It makes us very uncomfortable. And I think this past year with the pandemic, and the military being brought in to some nursing homes, long-term care facilities, I think it kind of came up and it sort of smacked us in the face of what was happening in some of these places. And how do folks talk about it? This to me is the big question. How do the folks that it is happening to talk about it? Particularly if it's something that's happened to them previously in their lives and they were never able to talk about it or didn't get support. How do they know how to talk about it now? Who do they share this information with? Who do they talk about it with? How do they disclose safely? And how do we, as support people or service providers, respond to those disclosures? You know, I think that for the most part, to some extent, we have started again to talk much more openly about the different forms of abuse that we know older adults or seniors might be experiencing. We talk about the financial abuse, certainly. We know that that's out there. We talk about the verbal and the physical and the emotional abuse that we know is often being perpetrated towards older adults. I also feel that it's important, and I'm sort of sticking it in here, and I will probably stick it in other places as well, because it's really important for me that we acknowledge this, that folks are not coming simply or solely with their experience of sexual trauma. They're coming with the totality of their life experiences. And so for a person of color, for a Black person, for Indigenous folks, for folks with a disability of some sort, either a developmental disability or a physical disability or some sort of mental health issue, we know that these folks also experience multi-layers of oppression and potentially abuse as a result of who they are or what they look like. So it's really important that when we talk about sexual trauma, that we understand that there is more than that trauma that has impacted someone in their lives. So we talk about those now a bit more openly, the ones that I've just mentioned. But I feel like the one form of abuse that we still don't talk about quite as openly is around sexual abuse. Why is that? Why is it that that one is so much more difficult to talk about? And I personally think that one of the reasons that it's so very difficult to talk about sexual abuse or sexual trauma amongst older adults is because it means we also have to talk about sex. And I'm now going to pose the next question to you. How comfortable are you talking about sex with an older adult? Let's give it a minute or two and see what kind of response we get. Okay. Somebody just posted something. Somebody just responded, if everyone can see it, as long as it's not my parents, that's okay. That's how I feel too. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone, so much for your engagement and your participation. And again, it seems like there was a bit of a mix. I got a lot of comfortable, or it depends on who. And that makes sense as well, of course, that it might depend on who the person is and what our relationship with them is. And I can't help but wonder, with all of the responses that I got that said, yes, very comfortable, no problem, I can't help but wonder if those were predominantly service providers that are out there. Because I think, it's probably not, I'm not going to suggest that it's super easy, but it's probably a little bit easier for us as service providers because it's one of the things that we're taught, right? We're taught how to have conversations, how to engage, how to invite discussion. So we can be pretty good sometimes at having those conversations. But I wonder about the support people who aren't service providers, what their comfort level might be. And I also wonder about the folks who have experienced the violence, how comfortable they're going to be. Because even though we know sexual abuse or trauma is not about sex, right? We know that. But the reality is that it does become a sexual act. And the other reality is that sexual trauma impacts one's ability to be able to necessarily feel comfortable and safe engaging in other sexual or intimate relationships. So while we're talking about sexual trauma, we do have to talk about sex. I want to just share that one of the things, this is one of the things that I did in those few opportunities that I had to go out and do some of these presentations with groups of seniors at community centers. Back in the day when we did that in person and I got to walk around and do that stuff that I like to do. I ask these questions that I've posed to all of you, who's divorced, who's widowed, who has entered the dating scene, who's doing online dating. And then I ask the question, who do you talk about sex with? If you wanted to talk about a sexual relationship or a sexual issue, who are you going to talk to? Are you going to talk to your kids? Well, that just brought a lot of laughter from the audience because they're not going to talk to their kids. Do they talk to their siblings? Do they talk to friends? Who do they in fact have these conversations with? And if it feels like the other person is not comfortable having these conversations, then the person who has experienced the trauma is also not going to feel comfortable having these conversations. I think we need to be having these conversations with older adults in the same way that we're having them with youth nowadays. There's a lot of focus, and as well there should be. I don't dispute that. I think it's important that we create awareness and we educate young people out there today who are just maybe entering into the dating scene, the relationship scene, or who have experienced other forms of sexual abuse. But as much as we're focusing a lot of our energy on youth, I think we also need to be having these very frank, open, and sometimes very awkward conversations with older adults. We need to be talking about things like consent and boundaries and rape culture and protection and safety. We need to be talking about these things so that older adults are also armed with appropriate, useful information and resources. And we need to be able to find a way to gather information, to ask questions, in a way that doesn't judge and that doesn't blame and that hopefully also doesn't embarrass the other person. Oh, perfect, Laura. Thank you. So I guess I'm going to shift over now to what does it mean to be trauma informed? And again, I think, the term, the concept, the idea of being trauma informed is certainly I will say, a very popular one today. And I think that those of us who are doing direct service, who are providing therapy, counseling, it's very important to us that we do our work in what is a trauma-informed way or a trauma-informed approach. And I myself have been to other webinars on trauma-informed work and what that looks like. And one of the things that's important for me, particularly in being mindful of the audience that may be out there today, I know that we have an awful lot of service providers that have registered for today, but I know that we also have a lot of community folk. We have folks that are just out there from our communities, older folks, perhaps some of their support people who may have tuned in today to perhaps see if there's something that they might be able to learn that might perhaps make their experience of either being a survivor more understandable, but also might help to support the support person who's helping the survivor. And one of the things that's important to me is to use accessible language. I'm not a research expert. I'm not a scholar. I'm not going to be sort of waxing on about different statistics or different research that's out there. There's a lot of information out there, and we can find it, we can Google it, it's out there. So for the purposes of today, to just be able to have this conversation with all of you, I want what I'm talking about to be accessible and understandable for everybody. And I know that's important for me. When I attend a webinar, I want to be able to understand the information that's being shared with me. And when we look at this whole notion of trauma informed, one of the most important pieces is that it's not only about the relationship between the counselor or the support person and the person who's experienced trauma. I'm not quite there yet, Laura. I want to just share a couple of things. Thank you. I want to just share a couple of things that I think are important for me and important for us to know. So a trauma-informed approach starts with the full understanding of the physical, the emotional, and the social impacts that trauma can have, both on the individual that is being helped, as well as on the one doing the helping. And I think it's really important that we recognize and acknowledge that, because the other thing that we talk a lot about is secondary trauma or compassion fatigue or burnout. We talk a lot about vicarious trauma, and what this means essentially is the trauma that we might experience as helpers or support people when we are working with somebody who has been traumatized, who has experienced trauma in their lives. We experience that, we can experience that vicariously through them, and can then start to experience some of the symptoms that they might be experiencing as a trauma survivor. I am going to share a definition that I found particularly relevant and helpful and appropriate. This isn't my definition. This definition comes from the Institute on Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care. And I really liked it because it was simple, it was accessible, and it really resonated with me. So trauma-informed care understands and considers the pervasive nature of trauma and promotes environments of healing and recovery, rather than practices or services that may inadvertently re-traumatize the person. So the reason I really like that is because it really speaks to the framework that is so important to have when working with survivors of trauma. A framework that includes and informs all of our practices, our procedures, our policies, and our settings. At the center, we have worked very, very hard and very, very diligently over the past few years to really create an environment that is healthy and supportive to all, not only to the folks that are coming in seeking service, but to the folks that are there providing the services. So the counselors, the volunteers, the students, everybody gets to benefit from these practices, these policies and procedures that are sort of now written in stone in terms of how we engage, how we behave, how we respond, even things like how we decorated our space, and just sort of trying to be mindful again of the different layers and the different experiences that folks might come in with. So even thinking about pictures that we hang, sayings that we put up, we really thought long and hard and really tried to create a space where anybody who was coming in would be able to say, I think I feel comfortable here. I think I'm going to be accepted here. And that's so important to be able to offer someone. So I want to just share briefly some of the things that we've done at the center to really truly incorporate this trauma-informed approach. We have weekly team meetings where we check in with one another around how we're all doing. We have external supervision that we brought in. All of the counselors have both individual supervision, and we also have monthly clinical team meetings. We have set up monthly meetings for our volunteers so that they can come together and share. Our volunteers are the heart and soul of DRCC. They're the front line. They are the first person that somebody may talk to when a volunteer has responded on our 24-hour crisis and support line. And folks will judge how they feel about the center based on the response that they may have received on the crisis line. The students that come in, we have placement practicum students that come in. We've also set up bi-weekly meetings for them to be able to come together and talk about what does it mean to be a student in an agency such as this one? What do we need to learn? What do we need to know? How can we support one another as students? So we've really tried to create that space for everybody that works there. We have self-care hours that we are allowed to take every week that is paid. We have mental health days. We are encouraged and supported in further developing ourselves by going to different webinars and trainings and educational opportunities to further our knowledge base. All of these things help to create a space that invites the client to be able to do the work on their healing. So how does that translate? What does that look like when we're working with older adults or seniors? What does it look like? So at the center, and I suspect at a lot of other different places, agencies as well, we have 5 guiding principles that we use to inform and guide us in our work. All of these things, of course, are interconnected, interrelated, but they're very important things that we have been very mindful about in terms of, again, trying to create the most comfortable and welcoming space, even if that means we're doing it virtually or on the phone. We try to create that environment that, again, helps people feel welcomed. So these are the principles that we follow. So safety. Safety is about, as I spoke to a few moments ago, having settings, policies, procedures that ensure that sense of both that physical and emotional well-being. Folks need to know that when they either come into the center or when they're speaking to us virtually, or they're speaking to us over the phone, that they will be treated with the utmost respect and consideration. And once again, the totality of their lives will be considered and not ignored. Trustworthiness. This one is so important. We set very clear, defined expectations, guidelines, and roles. We want the folks that we're working with to know that what we say they can expect from us, they can expect from us. So we're very clear about the length of time we can see someone. We're very clear about the length of the counseling session. We're very clear about what our role is as a counselor. It's not to tell them what to do. It's not to necessarily fix things, but we're there sort of as a support and as a guide, and we're there to offer information, resources, suggestions, ideas that will hopefully be helpful to them in their lives moving forward. We're not there to live their lives for them or to tell them what to do. We're there to try to help them figure out what they need to do based on all of the different stuff that we share with them. Collaboration. This is also very important. And again, speaks to what I spoke to very early when I started to talk about the importance of collaboration and partnerships with other agencies that are also working with older adults and who have that expertise. It's so important that we collaborate with others and that we collaborate with the individual themselves so that they are a part of their treatment plan. So by maximizing the roles of others. So for example, if the person is also involved in, other healthcare systems, if they have a medical doctor or a psychiatrist, or they have perhaps support people in their lives, community support people or personal support people. It's really important that all these folks are on the same page with somebody's healing or treatment plan. And we strongly encourage and support this collaboration so that we're all working together. You know, that old saying, I believe in it very strongly. This again speaks to, I suppose, my age. But, they say it takes a village to raise a child. It's not quite the same, but it takes a community to support an individual. Oh, okay. I just got a note from Laura that I need to wrap up. So I'll just say very quickly, choice, informing them of all the available and reasonable resources and options, and empowerment, empowering, encouraging, and supporting them to also utilize their own strengths as well to develop their treatment plan. Laura, do I have a moment to make a closing remark?
Absolutely. I encourage you to do that, Lynn. We've just gotten a lot of really wonderful questions, so I want to be able to leave some time. So go ahead.
Okay. I want to sort of do this quickly, but I'm also mindful of the ASL interpreters, and I need to not rush through my words, so I'll try to find that balance. We know that sexual violence has an all-encompassing and lifelong impact on folks. And we know that when it comes to working with older adults, there are all those additional layers that I also talked about. They've now lived their whole life being impacted by this experience. I think there's an extra layer that I just want to mention that is added when we look at how we respond to older adults and how they're treated in our, or thought of in our society. They are not always respected, and they're certainly not revered as they are in some other cultures. A lot of folks don't think that older adults can be sexually assaulted because they're not having sex. I'm here to tell you, and I hope that all the other folks in the webinar would agree with me that are also older adults. We're here to tell you we're having sex. But what that also means is that we can also experience being sexually assaulted. And why do they have the right to still talk about it now, even though it may be decades behind them and it's not going to change anything? Because older adults have the right to live the rest of their lives with some peace and some relief of that burden, which is why I think it's so important to have opportunities like today so that we can begin to have these frank and open conversations with older adults and their supporters to give them as much information and resources to better support themselves. Okay, I did it, Laura. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I did really want to give a chance to be able to hit on some of these important questions we're getting. If I could just call on my colleague, Christine, to maybe pull out some themes that we're seeing in the questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Lynn. Lynn, you know that we partner and serve women and men and the whole beautiful diversity of 2S LGBT plus communities. So with regard to men, though, there's a question from Emily about, what resources are there specifically for older men who have experienced sexual violence?
Right. That's a great question. And unfortunately, my answer is not going to be a terrific one. There really are not many resources at all. There are limited enough resources for women, let alone men, which is why at the center, we have in fact been trying to secure additional funding, not from our core funder, but be able to support a program that in fact would allow us to be able to work with men. So someone else here just said it. John Howard is typically my go-to place. John Howard has some wonderful programs. They absolutely do in fact work with men as well. Family Services Durham and Catholic Family Services both will also do trauma work with men, and they will work with men who were sexually abused as children. Those are sort of the top. Oh, and see, Peggy's also adding something about community justice initiatives. Oh, that's in Kitchener. Okay, that's in Kitchener, so that's not here in Durham region. The other thing is that there is a 1-800 support line through Family Services. I'm so sorry, I don't know the number offhand. You could probably go to Family Services website and perhaps find it there. It is a 1-800 number that is specifically for men who have experienced sexual violence. I think I should probably add very quickly that although we don't see men in counseling, we do support them on our 24-hour crisis and support line. So I do want to say that if any man should call our crisis line, they would absolutely be able to get support. And our volunteers also have those numbers and that information that they would be able to share as resources.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lynn. I have a question from Patricia. Is there a report or a study on sexual abuse of residents in care homes that you can share?
I personally do not have anything like that. I'm sorry. I actually wonder if Laura, if you might know something about that, or if you know of any studies that have been done.
Thanks, Lynn. So the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse did receive grant monies a few years ago. I'm unsure if it was specific on long-term care, but what I will promise our attendees today is that along with our recording and the slide deck today is we will be posting any relevant resources.
Great. I think I've asked the two main questions, but wanted to also tell you that we have had wonderful comments in the chat box. Deborah McCarthy was saying she's astonished at senior women who are dating via online contact and not practicing protected or safe sex, and that we really need the conversation.
Absolutely. You know, my hope, if I may just say, my hope is that also following this is to have conversations both with Laura and other members of the Durham Elder Abuse Network to really try to sort of find out, are there places that we can go where older adults are gathering, where they're having meetings? You know, I know, for example, my parents who are 89 and 91 live in Montreal, Quebec, and they're a member of a seniors community group, and they have meetings every week, and they have speakers that come in and they talk about different things. I would love to be able to see us do more of that and really sort of start to be able to have that one-on-one kind of conversation or discussion or engagement. Because I think those are the folks that we need to be talking to. We need to be talking to those older adults and encouraging those conversations. And I think once they know that we're comfortable and we can talk about them, I think that then gives permission for them to be able to speak more openly. I wanted to just also say one more thing, if I just may add in. One of the things that's really, really important when we're working with older adults, and again, I suspect that all of the service providers out there today will know this, is that it's so important that we don't go right to the abuse. We don't meet with somebody, we don't start to talk with somebody and immediately start to ask them questions about what happened to them and what they experienced and what the sexual abuse was like. The first thing that we want to do, and this goes back to, again, the layers and the totality of their whole life experience. We want to know who they are, what their lives looked like, what was their young adulthood like or their teenage years like. If they were married, what did their marriage look like? Was it healthy? Was it abusive? How did it inform their parenting if they have children? You know, we invite and we are curious about other things that have happened in their life. And only when we start to, and then we ask folks, what are the things, you know, what do you identify as a problem or as a concern in your life? What is it that brought you here today? What is it that you would like to be talking about here today? And then once we start to talk about those things, which are very often not about the sexual abuse, right? They're about something completely and utterly different. Then we start to try to make those connections and we start to sort of bring it back to that understanding of how the trauma informed somebody moving forward in their lives.
Well, thank you so much, Lynn. I just feel like we need to have you back for a second webinar. This is a huge issue. I know that we saw a big increase after the hashtag #MeToo.
Oh, yeah.
Of younger, older adults coming forward. As you said, it is a complex and layered issue. I do want to point our attendees today to appropriate resources. I find that these resources here will be helpful for those of you. So we have, I want to direct you to Victim Services, the Ontario Network for Victim Services. You can find all of your local community victim services on this website here on the slide, as well as the Ontario Network for Sex Assault and Domestic Violence Treatment Centers. If you use this link, you can just type in your location and it'll bring you to your own local sex assault center. And then as well, Ministry of Attorney General has a 24/7 victim support line. Also, along with our webinar and slides being posted after the webinar today, we will also make available, we have a fact sheet on sexual violence among older adults. And we also have an intervention guide for service providers around sexual abuse of older adults. So please stay tuned. We'll also be posting those on our social media channels. I do want to highlight for everybody that We are happy to have Jeremy Bertrand back from the Ministry of Finance, and he will be hosting a webinar in collaboration with us around understanding Ontario's personal income tax credits during C19. So please log in, register for that, and it will be available in French as well as English. And this is my contact information. Please, if you have any questions, reach out. And thank you everyone for attending. Lynn, thank you. Great webinar. And everyone, take care and be well.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Laura, for having me. Bye, everyone.
Bye.